Welcome to Inside Medical Malpractice, and thank you once again so very much for being here. Today is the third of a four-part series on trauma-informed lawyering. But I just want to say once again that this is a series for everyone. Whether you're a lawyer, a healthcare provider, a family who has experienced medical trauma, or someone who knows someone who has, I promise you're going to find something valuable today. I mentioned in the first couple of episodes that the idea for this podcast series came from Sonia Nidger, a lawyer from Neinstein Personal Injury Firm in Toronto. The story goes like this. Earlier this year, I was traveling in Vietnam, sitting in a hotel room, when I got a phone call from Sonia saying she was planning a trauma-informed workshop for her firm, and she thought that it might make a great podcast. We spoke again a few weeks later, and she told me that the workshop was fantastic. It had been very well received, and that the two speakers, Olivia Scobie and Kara Harden, were outstanding. I fell in love with Sonia's idea, and here we are today. Sonia is my guest today. In part one of this series, we started with Olivia Scobie, a registered social work counselor. If you haven't listened to her podcast, please do. I'm telling you, there is so much to learn in that. Olivia offers a great primer for the whole series by defining some key phrases and terms, by teaching us how to recognize trauma in others and ourselves. And she talked in particular about birth trauma at its different intersections in the journey, in pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. She focused not only on the trauma that might be experienced by the patient and their family, but the vicarious trauma experienced by extended family, friends, care providers, and eventually the lawyers who litigate the cases. In the second episode, we spoke to Kara Harden. She's a former lawyer, mental health educator, and co-founder of the Practice Lab in Toronto. This is another fabulous episode. Kara took us through to the next step by examining how our own past affects us, offers some concrete examples of how our personal traumas show up at work, and how all of this together affects the way we deal with the people who've been traumatized. Kara taught us about self-management, co-management, how being trauma-informed can help us take better care of ourselves and take better care of other people. I'm telling you, I learned so much from those two, Olivia and Kara. They are two great episodes. In the final episode, which will drop next month, we're going to talk to a mother of an infant who was severely injured during the birth process, someone who's gone through the lengthy and difficult journey of a malpractice lawsuit. She's going to share her story of the birth, the challenges of dealing with the legal system, the trauma that has affected every single part of her life, her personal life, her son's life, her family's life, her career, and her mental health. She has such a story to share with us, and she is so brave to tell us. But today in episode 3, we're going to talk to Sonia Nidger, whose idea it was to make this podcast at all. She is first going to answer some questions. If there's time, present a case study on a birth trauma, talk about her own day-to-day experience as a lawyer of dealing with traumatized clients, and in Sonia's case, how the relatively recent birth of her own child was somewhat traumatic. Lawyers have told me that their practice and their relationship with clients improves with an increased understanding of traumatic experiences, that it's an advantage to understand how trauma presents at work and to offer counsel in a way that minimizes re-traumatization of the client, encourages trust, encourages empowerment, while also protecting the lawyer from the impact of vicarious trauma. And again, let me just say this, I learned so much. This is not just for lawyers. This everyone listening can benefit from today. So Sonia, my guest today, is an associate lawyer and director of business development and knowledge management at Neinstein Personal Injury Lawyers in Toronto. Her practice is focused on medical malpractice, and she is known for her commitment and her belief that the medical and legal systems can work together for greater patient safety. I share that belief with you every day, Sonia. She is a board member at Reconnect Community Health Services, as well as a research and ethics board at a community hospital. She's both the chair and board member of the medical malpractice section of the Ontario Trial Lawyers Association, and she's a member of the Law Society of Alberta, her home province and mine. And Sonia is frequently published on medical legal issues, as well as issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion in the law office. She's been recognized by the best lawyers in Canada as one to watch since 2021. This all sounds fantastic. So welcome, Sonia. Sonia, thank you so much, both for this fantastic idea and for being here today.
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so delighted that this idea has come to fruition and that you've been so interested in talking about these really important issues. So thanks so much for giving us the time and space to do that.
You're so welcome. I just can't get over how much I learned, and I just wish I knew all of this as a care provider. I wish I'd known all of it about 40 years ago, but I'm grateful to be learning it today.
Yeah, it's such an important topic. I think it's one that transcends the medical, legal spaces, certainly. I think it's one, as you say, that anybody who's interested in patient safety, in really understanding what medical experiences can be like for themselves and for their families would be interested in learning about these concepts. So yeah, I agree with you. I think it's definitely time for us to be talking about these issues.
It is. So let's get down to some questions. First of all, when I imagine being a lawyer, I always imagine it as a really tough job. And I always imagine medical malpractice law is the toughest of a tough job. What is it that led you into the area of malpractice law?
My answer to this is always that nothing really did lead me into it. I sort of fell into it. I worked at this firm, Neinstein, since I've been here since the beginning of my career. And I happened to be starting my career around the time that our firm really expanded its scope in doing medical malpractice work and ended up having many really top, excellent litigators in the country join our firm to develop that practice. And I was just at sort of the beginning of my career journey and really fell into the work and had an opportunity to work alongside Duncan Embury, who's been a recent or past guest of this podcast, and thought that the work that he was doing was so important, interesting, intellectually stimulating, and just a really unique opportunity to meld together two areas, medicine and law. And I just sort of fell in love with the idea of being an advocate for injured plaintiffs. And that's what's led me here more than 10 years later.
Well, congratulations. And it sounds like you've done nothing but great work. I want to just ask you, because I would imagine that almost every client you see comes in, especially a medical malpractice client, has come in with a very either difficult illness or experience within the healthcare system and arrives at your place with some degree of trauma. As a young lawyer just moving into this, how were you affected by that reality that you're such a close-up witness to clients at a very difficult time in their lives?
I think it was really difficult, to say the least, at the beginning of my career, because you, as a young lawyer, all you really want is to make change, to be an advocate, to help people, particularly when you choose a career in this space. And it was really difficult for me to understand that my role couldn't be a panacea or a fix-all for these people who were coming to us with really serious problems. I couldn't fix what had happened. What my famous line is, what you really need is a time machine, and I can't build that for you. We can't be everything to these really vulnerable people who come to us, but we are a really important piece of the puzzle for them. We are often the first people that they're coming to with their story. We're often, one of the first people who they feel like they should tell us the full story, or that they feel comfortable, really voicing what their experience was. And that's a really serious responsibility. And you're right to say that that's a really emotionally charged responsibility. I think at the beginning it was very difficult to not want to, or to feel like I couldn't, be everything, the social worker, the counselor, the fixer of all the problems, because that's our impulse when somebody comes into your office and tells you these horrible things that have happened to you. And, in a position of relative power, we have resources that maybe we can connect them to, or, we can certainly lend more than I think other areas and professions can. With that said, there are limitations to what we can do. There are limitations to what lawyers, can even promise in terms of what the justice system can do, right? The civil system is great. It's one recourse. It's an important recourse that's available, but it really is about one thing, which is compensation. And sometimes people come in and they don't really care about that. What they really want is for their story to be heard, and they want, justice in a sense that they want something to change in the system. They want the conduct of this professional to be looked at and scrutinized and changed. And that's not necessarily what the civil justice system is about. We certainly hope that the overarching, effect of the work that we do is to improve quality and to impact change. But that's not necessarily what it's about at the individual level. And that can be really difficult as a young advocate to know that you have one tool, albeit an important tool, but it's not going to fix everything for this family or for this client. And so, it's definitely a challenge. And I've had to really learn and evolve my way of thinking through that.
How did you learn and evolve, and how did you learn just as before you had any trauma-informed lawyering, we know what we know now, how did you separate yourself from that pain and trauma?
I think it was certainly just experience. There's a certain point, particularly in those early years of lawyering, where this is a very big part of life, right? I was working many, many hours. I was devoting a lot of time to my practice, and it was really hard to separate those things. I would often bring home the stories of my clients, and, sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking about them and the way that their lives were going as a result of this medical error. And so I think it was experience. It was realizing that burnout is a real thing. And that's not just because you're working a lot of hours and you're tired. It's the emotional tax, right, that this work does. And you can't really be an effective advocate if you yourself are not taking care of your mental health and, your sort of stamina. And so it was experience. I had a lot of dark nights of the soul where, you realize that something's got to give, and you really have to separate yourself. And if you want to be effective for your clients, you have to do your best to separate yourself and take care of yourself. So I think it was really just experience and opportunities to examine what was happening, on a day-to-day level with my practice and the way that I felt about my practice.
It sounds good the way you managed it. I've asked other lawyers that question, and sometimes they say, it doesn't bother me. I'm like, it has to. I was telling Olivia even that I said sometimes I put my hand on their chest to make sure they have a beating heart in there, because this stuff can't not get to you. It's just difficult, and I guess you'll just find different ways to cope with it. But I can relate to you in the sense that in healthcare, when those bad things do happen, and you're the frontline person or even a witness to what's going on, and you have very little time to process or deal, or there certainly is no sit down and cry and take to the bed for 3 days. There's none of that going on.
There's not only none of that going on, but I think the unique thing about your role as a healthcare provider, and certainly my role as a medical malpractice lawyer, is that the things that are happening to my clients are things that could happen to me. They could happen to my family. They could happen to my child. They hit very close to home. And something that I like to always say about this work and about the importance of our healthcare system is that in Canada, we have made a decision that the right to healthcare and the access to quality healthcare is fundamental to how we identify as Canadian. It's fundamental to the fabric of our society. And when that's threatened, when that access and that feeling of being safe in that system is threatened, it affects all of us, right? It's a community-based issue. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. We can have all sorts of philosophical and political debates about our public healthcare system, but we have decided as a society that the right to health is inherent to who we are. And so the threat to that is different. It hits home differently. And certainly the first few years of my practice, that was very, I was hypervigilant. And we'll get to talking about my experience, during my pregnancy and labor and delivery. But that hypervigilance can be really hard to deal with. It can be really difficult. And I think when we're talking about vicarious trauma, that's certainly how it's manifested most for me. And for my colleagues, I think they would agree with that.
Well, why don't we move into that subject right now? Because you've opened up perfectly to tell that story. Tell us just a little bit about the birth of your baby. It was a couple of years ago, I guess. The good and the bad. And I understand some events during both the pregnancy and the birth were somewhat traumatic or traumatizing for you. Let's hear your story.
Sure. Yeah. And I will sort of caution, I guess, or put a caveat around traumatizing. I think that the idea is that they were traumatizing for me in particular because of my unique position in the healthcare system as both an advocate on behalf of plaintiffs who have been harmed, and then, of course, a consumer and user of the healthcare system. And so I was hypervigilant, right? I do a lot of obstetrical work, and my firm does a lot of obstetrical work. I would say predominantly that's sort of our area of focus. And I knew a lot about what could go wrong. And I was right from the minute I found out that, we were going to be blessed with a baby. I had a lot of thoughts, a lot of intrusive thoughts about what could go wrong, about how much advocacy I would have to do for myself to make sure and guard against those risks that to me felt very predominant and very, I guess, likely, even though statistically they are not likely at all, right? Our healthcare system overwhelmingly, despite the fact that I make my living asserting that it's not a safe system, is actually a safe system.
It is, yeah.
And so I had a lot of thoughts about what could go wrong. I, throughout my pregnancy, was, checking in with all sorts of people that I've met along my career journey that can, provide some expertise and, what should I do with this? And, should I get my ultrasounds looked at again? Things like that frankly are, they take away from the joy of being pregnant and of the expectations that come along with that. And it's only now looking back that I think, I wish that I had maybe gotten, whether it's mental health support to deal with sort of that aspect, or, was more open about the fact that I was feeling those things earlier, because I think there was a point in my pregnancy where I realized that those were thoughts that I was having, and it was really impeding my ability to experience joy during that moment. And keeping in mind too the context of my pregnancy, which was in the middle of the COVID pandemic, so there was lots of fear about health and all sorts of other collateral issues at that time. And so it was an interesting time to be pregnant, I'll tell you that. And I realized probably around the end of my second trimester, beginning of my third, that I needed help, and I needed to be able to talk about these things. And so I got it, right? Like, I set myself up for success in terms of being able to really handle what was about to come. And the labor and delivery period is this big, bad, scary thing that we've made, I think, in this part of the world. I think it's been medicalized to a point that there is some inherent fear instilled in us about what might happen. And so I got some help. I got some help to really talk these issues out and to think about what was reasonable and rational. I had a wonderful care team, and I really trusted the physicians and nurses and allied supports that were around me. And that was really critical. I was very active in ensuring that, the people who were put in charge of me were people that I could feel that way about. And so I really am so grateful to them for understanding my position. There was always a caveat to all of my appointments. They would like if I needed over explanation, which often was the case, they would be happy to provide me with it and devote the time to do it, because they knew that, these were anxieties that I held. And so I got the help, and then luckily my labor and delivery process was relatively straightforward, except for the fact that I had one particular sort of, whether you call it a birth plan or number one sort of priority on my plan was to not be induced, because a lot of the work that I do has to do with the administration of Syntocin or synthetic oxytocin, and the harms that can have. And I'll just caveat this by saying, of course, there are many, many, many instances in which induction is completely safe, and that's not an inherently bad thing. It's just, for me, it didn't feel like the right thing that I could handle mentally. And so there was a moment in my journey to delivery where that was being contemplated. I had a rupture of membranes before I went into active labor, and that is sometimes dangerous for the baby. So you have to typically have to deliver the baby within 24 hours. And I was getting pretty close. And that was very scary for me. The idea of being induced was very scary for me. And I just realized that in that moment, I realized that the position that I occupied of being able to advocate for myself, being able to articulate and explain why, I preferred a certain method of delivery over another, or, what exactly my fears were and how that related practically to the situation that I was in, was such a position of privilege and power, because I had the knowledge, I had the language, I had the trust of my healthcare team to understand that my concerns were valid, and that, I could speak to them at a certain level. I mean, I'm by no means a doctor, but I'm familiar with, that world. And so I had a real realization about the position that many of my clients have been in, when they want to voice concern or preference about what is done to their body, issues that impact their bodily autonomy and their safety and their ability to feel safe. And that's something that I realized very early on in the labor and delivery period, is that you have to feel safe. When you're about to have a baby, you have to feel safe. Your body needs to feel safe. Your mind needs to feel safe. And so many of my clients, I would say without exception, were put in positions where they didn't feel safe, right? And that was very eye-opening for me. I luckily did not require an induction, ended up having my baby. Everything was totally fine. And we were very lucky. We were one of the lucky ones to be able to sort of get out very soon after, delivering and get on with our lives. But it was really eye-opening for me about how difficult that system is to interact with when you don't have the language and you don't occupy a position of relative privilege or power. I think my identity as a racialized woman was very obvious to me, at certain points during my pregnancy and labor and delivery. I think it's true that minority, racialized people and minority communities and communities in lower socioeconomic demographics are treated differently by the healthcare system, but whether that's by default because of systemic things that have been set up by people who don't look like us, or because of implicit biases. And, I, again, occupy a relative space and position of power and privilege. And it was very real to me that many people don't. Particularly people who, who identify as racialized and occupy different spaces. So all of these things came full circle for me after having my baby, and I really wanted to do something about it. I wanted to make sure that when I went back and started advocating for people who, have experienced harm in the medical system, that all of these issues, these systemic issues were brought forth and recognized and acknowledged, and the trauma, implicit and explicit, that can happen just by interacting with the healthcare system, let alone having something bad happen to you in it, is real. And it impacts the way that you carry yourself in the world. It impacts the way that, you certainly interact with the legal system, and your ability to tell your story, and your feeling of being safe, is so paramount, as I've mentioned. And so this was all sort of the context for, I think, what's ended up to be this conversation, certainly, Chris, with you. And my desire to ensure that all of us who are in this space doing this work have an appreciation for that.
Well, I just want to say thank you for the tenacity, and I'm sure it was a job to bring this to light and to convince, your firm and other lawyers how important this was. But a couple of things I was thinking while you were talking. The first is I fully understand your hypervigilance during your pregnancy. I mean, I often look at childbearing age women doing medical malpractice law, and I've done a couple of podcasts with Maya Tomjanovic. And, really questioned, how do you go into a healthcare system that you've spent your career convincing people that it's incompetent, and then, or whatever, I don't know, that's maybe a bad word, Sonia, but how do you go into it then and hand over your body and your child's body and trust that things are going to go well? So kudos to you for going into it, seeking help in your pregnancy, because I fully understand. A lot of healthcare providers really struggle with that too. I mean, we've got every disease on the planet, or I think I do, and my kids do, and my husband does too, just because I know too much. I know more than I wish I did. And that a cold can turn into meningitis, and then somebody's dead before you've had dinner, like I know that stuff. So I think there's a lot of us that work in the medical space and the medical legal space that have to struggle with that. But the other thing is, like, I just want to say I admire you too for having your birth plan and your wits about you in labor, because not everybody has their own voice or their own capacity to speak for themselves and to stand up for themselves. So good for you. And what a crappy time to have a baby in the middle of COVID. I mean, I think all of us looking back on COVID are just like, that whole time was just so weird. So I hope that going forward, if you choose to have another child, that you're going to have a whole different experience. But now so much more too, right? I mean, now you've got some help. You know what it's like. You can deliver vaginally without oxytocin, and things go well. I wanted to ask you about something you just said there in the end, about how racialized minorities really struggle within the healthcare system. Are there issues from your perspective with issues around diversity, equality, or inclusion that affect the way that you have personally received or processed or have the capacity to seek support for the trauma that you've experienced?
Yeah, I think the issues of diversity and the experience of racialized minorities in the healthcare system is completely not talked about in the way that it needs to be. It's just the discussion around it and the discourse around it is disproportionate, frankly, to the gravity of this problem. We, I think, all acknowledge implicitly that it is a problem, or that it can be a problem. But particularly for Indigenous women, Black women, and, generally BIPOC women, accessing maternal health, there's so many intersections to this problem, right? It's not being listened to, not being given agency to have a voice, to have an opinion about your own body, being dismissed as attention seeking, for example, or pain seeking. There are so many intersections to this problem that are very real and affecting care from your family doctor's office to, needing emergency care to obstetrical care. And so I myself, like I said, I'm a racialized woman. I'm a young racialized woman in a healthcare system that is not designed for me. And I've had to really speak up, certainly, about specific things that I just know not to be true that are being told to me. But I occupy a position of power and privilege that many women who look like me don't. Right. And that is that reality that is sort of, that acknowledgement is so important for those of us who do have power and privilege. We have to recognize, we have to understand that our experiences are not the experiences of others, that the systems that we're accessing and even trying to access on their behalf are not designed for them. And so we have to navigate those systems differently. And that's really where, accessing additional supports, making sure that we, for example, if you have a client who, let's say a racialized client who had a very poor birth outcome and has now, to deal with, the consequences of that, and their children have to deal with the consequences of that. When you're telling those stories, and that's what we do as lawyers, we tell stories, you can't separate their identity from their experience. You have to become competent in the cultural experience, in the, in that experience that is so entrenched in who they are and their identity. And that is, so something that is not really talked about. We think that, by providing equitable services, meaning we service everybody, that's kind of enough. And we're doing the job that we're tasked to do. But cultural competence is competence, right? And I learned that from an amazing Indigenous lawyer, Alyssa Lombard, who actually just recently spoke at our MedMal conference about systemic inequities in healthcare as it relates particularly to Indigenous women and maternal health. And what she says is so true. Cultural competence is competence, right? We have to place ourselves in that space. And those issues are so paramount. And so accessing supports, connecting. And this is really where, for example, speaking to somebody like Olivia, who has so much knowledge about the system and she's honestly like an encyclopedia for mental health supports particularly for women, across the province. And she'll say, this is important. Like for some people, particularly for racialized women, sometimes they need to have a racialized healthcare provider or mental health provider, right, in order to really place themselves in the specific circumstances that they've experienced. And so, it's just so important, and we can't talk about it enough, really. Particularly when it comes to women's health, it's just so. It's the absolute, how do I put this? I guess diplomatically, just the absolute ignorance, I would say. I don't know if that's diplomatic or not, but the ignorance of how much our identities affect our experience in accessing healthcare is really a problem. It's really a problem. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's an area that I just think is so not talked about enough.
I think it answers the question, but also opens about 1 million doors for a big conversation. Excuse me. So that's maybe something we could talk about on a deeper level another time, because it's kind of interesting. I'm just reading through. I try to do some, medical reading every morning just to keep my brain sharp. And today there was a whole conversation about the 300 million women in the world who have no menopausal care, and some of the countries don't even have language for the word. The word menopause doesn't even exist. So the real life issues that women around the world, all races and all shapes and sizes. But I'm also just so struck by my own naivety for much of my career. I never or rarely had a conversation, our big conversation about understanding diversity in different races was just to have a hotline that we could phone for interpretation. We couldn't understand the language, which is not nothing, but it's really not anything. It's not nearly enough. And I think of all those times that I've helped women who didn't even speak a word of English have a baby. And I hope I was caring and compassionate and sympathetic, but I knew so little about their past experiences, their current experience, certainly nothing about their expectations and hopes for their labor and delivery. You would just get through it the best that you could with sign language and kind touch, and hopefully everybody gets a healthy baby at the end. But that's all I knew. I was never taught anymore. So that's why I was saying to Olivia right from the get-go, I wish I'd met you 40 years ago and we'd had this conversation.
That's exactly right. And I think the underpinning to all of this is that in the context of the patient and the healthcare provider, and I'm not just talking about physicians, the power differential there is extremely important to pay attention to. And for racialized women in particular who have consistently experienced that inequity in power in almost every other part of their life, for that to be experienced during your most vulnerable moment in your whole life, typically in giving birth. We know what the hormones during labor do to your brain, and that's everybody. And to put it, to really frame that in the context of this power differential is so important. And that affects, yes, bedside manner. That affects, the kinds of consent conversations that you're having. That affects the language that you're using. And I'm not just talking about English, right? Like I'm talking about being able to explain things in accordance with the circumstances of the patient. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a conversation that just hasn't been had enough at the healthcare level. I know that those are conversations that are being had more, no doubt. But it really does trickle down to what we do as lawyers, right? Which is, again, telling their stories. You can't tell a story that you don't know.
That's an excellent point. So you touched there just a minute ago about how trauma shows up in the patient. I have a question for you. Before you took this trauma-informed lawyering workshop, were you aware of how your own personal traumas showed up in the workplace? Or is that too personal of a question to ask you?
It's not too personal. I'm an open book. No, it's, I would say the answer to that is no. I didn't know that, my implicit held beliefs, for example, that are informed by my experiences, were having an impact on even the way I assess a case, right? Like, of course, I'm bringing to the assessment of somebody else's story, my story. It's just the way that it is. And that's really important to dissect. Sometimes that's productive. Sometimes that's helpful, right? Depending on, I guess, what your experiences have been. But no, I didn't have a really good understanding of that. I think as a lawyer, despite the fact that, we are zealous advocates for our clients, we have that sort of stereotypical, performative aspect to what we do. And so we want to be seen as, strong and unaffected and stoic and all of those descriptors. And that can really dampen or dilute, I guess, the real lived experiences that you're bringing, to your life and to your work. So no, I would say I didn't have a really good appreciation for those things. I think I tried really hard, particularly given my first couple of years of practice, to kind of divorce, myself from the work that I was doing. But the training and frankly, the discourse just since the training that has existed and has really, been different than before we started having these discussions, has encouraged all of us to be thinking about things in a different way.
That's awesome. And I want to hear about all that. But first, I'd like to hear the journey from your birth and your sense of the traumatic, or however you want to describe those experiences that you went through, the struggles that you went through in your pregnancy, labor, and delivery. How did this idea for a trauma-informed workshop come along? Was it out of that?
Yeah, it was very much out of that, actually. And maybe I didn't make the connection in my brain when we started thinking about these things, but it was very much out of that. It was out of an understanding that all of a sudden I'd had somewhat of an experience that a lot of my clients have had, or at least been in their positions to potentially have those experiences. And that was very heavy. And we historically, you know, I will admit, like in taking on files, particularly birth injury files, your focus is immediately and almost forever on the injured plaintiff, which is the baby. And of course, right, the baby is the one who's experienced now this completely life altering, often physical and cognitive injury. And the focus of the litigation is that and that baby. And so I never really gave a lot of thought to the experiences of the parents, particularly of the mother. And I always did feel like it was difficult for example, for me to get full information about what happened from moms when they came to us, and I just figured, like, of course they're busy, like they're busy taking care of their babies, you know, they don't remember every detail. And now I just have a completely different view about that, right? It was trauma. Like they were traumatized about what happened to them, their body. There's a level of like shame and guilt, which I think is completely misplaced, but very natural, that mothers who've experienced harm feel. And that can mask a lot of the narrative, and it can affect memory, and it can affect all sorts of things. And so, yeah, I had a different thought about that. I immediately felt, you know, protective over all of my clients who've had that experience. And I wanted to ensure that going forward, at least in my practice, that I gave credence to that experience, that I properly acknowledged and recognized that experience. And if we want to take it maybe a leg further, frankly, I think that our law doesn't do a good job in recognizing through compensation or otherwise the experience, the medical trauma that particularly mothers go through when this happens to them. And so in my way of thinking, I thought, let's get informed about what that trauma actually looks like. Let's really put a lot of attention to that issue so that when we are telling their stories and when we are advocating for their claims, we can do that accurately, and we can do that with a level of specificity that we certainly have not done before. And we can sort of force the judicial system to start paying attention to moms, right? And to dad and to parents, you know, I'm not trying to make this exclusive to just birthing mothers, certainly not. But often that trauma is, you know, it's placed differently on the shoulders of birthing mothers.
Yeah, that's a good point. And good luck with that, advancing the experience of the parents, the mother and the parents in trauma. Because I often think about that when there's a loss of a baby, and, you know, damage wise, that those aren't always lawsuits that are pursued, but the loss. And I've talked to mothers I have a sister who lost a baby 25 years ago, and it's still as close could be to her heart. And his birthday is still special and celebrated, and the day is still remembered in the greatest detail. It's affected many, many areas of her life. So you got this idea for a trauma-informed workshop, which I think is brilliant. And I'm glad that it's already, before you've even taken the trauma-informed workshop, I can hear that you've changed your practice or some of your approach. Was it a challenge to convince your coworkers to do this? And if so, how'd you get everybody on board?
So I have to say, it actually wasn't very much of a challenge at all. I think once I framed the issue in the way similar to what I've just framed with you, everyone's lights were on already, you know, to the extent that they weren't thinking about it before, which I think everybody had some idea that, you know, this was happening and that maybe we weren't fully versed in a way that we needed to be, given the work that we do. Everybody really bought in, and I have to give a very big shout out to my firm, to the managing partners at my firm who, you know, really put their money where their mouth is in terms of making sure that this was a priority. What I was more concerned about, more than buy-in, it was sort of the nature of the program. Like, it had to be consistent with, our daily life and goals as a law firm. So a fulsome, like, 6-week course wasn't going to cut it. But I also wanted to ensure that whatever programming we did bring to the table was comprehensive enough to at least get us started on these conversations and to let us think about things in a different way. So that was really where collaborating with Olivia and Kara came to light, and was, when I think back to it, just a really, really great way to get introduced and started into this world. They are amazing at what they do. They're such thought leaders in this space. And I think the unique sort of skill set that they both bring and that complement each other. And I think you probably got a sense of that when you spoke to them, albeit separately, but you can sort of just imagine how they play off of each other, was really useful in thinking about how to deliver this subject matter.
I think that they're honestly two of the most intelligent women I've ever spoken to, and both of them such great teachers, right? I mean, sometimes they're smart that you can't really understand what they're saying. They were brilliant and well-spoken and great teachers. I can't even imagine having the two of them in the same room for a day. I could have listened to both of them talk all afternoon if we didn't have short on time. So I'm assuming the workshop went well. Tell me about what some of the greatest insights were, yours and the other members of your office.
Yeah, I think some of the most important insights were that we all actually have thought about these things implicitly. Like, we all have had moments in our practice where we realized that there was a void in our knowledge and in our skill set, frankly, to deal with the very heavy trauma that our clients inevitably, anybody who's been harmed by anything carries with them that level of trauma, or at least a level of trauma. And add on to that the complexity of medical trauma. Everybody has their story. And so I think the insight was that we all did acknowledge that there were lots of times, in our day-to-day where we felt ill-equipped to handle the trauma and to interact with our clients in a way that felt meaningful to that experience, to validate that experience without going beyond our scope. And that's kind of where I guess I circle back to my first comment in this podcast, which is we're not social workers. We're not mental health professionals. We're not doctors. We're not any of those things. We are lawyers, but we occupy this kind of in-between space as advocates for people who have experienced this multi-level, multifaceted trauma that requires knowledge and I would say skills that go beyond just, day-to-day lawyering. And so all of us had felt that. And that was a really important insight that we all were kind of on board with the idea that there was this void that we needed to fill in terms of our approach. So that was really validating and really brought us all together, which was great. I think lots of people had the insight or came to a realization that this idea about cultural competence, that this isn't just like a nice to have thing, right? It's not like when I have time, I'll make it a priority. That cultural competence is competence. Again, shout out to Alyssa Lombard for that. And that was really important, right? So for people to understand that, you have, let's say, a racialized client come in the door, your first call doesn't have to necessarily be to the only racialized lawyer in the firm, right? There are ways to sort of bridge that gap, and important, right? We have to be able to do that. And so that was really important. And there were so many. I mean, we had a lot of really great moments where all of us felt like quite validated for not, and as a bunch of lawyers to admit that they don't know something was a unique experience and hard, I'm sure. But this is the kind of thing that you can't pretend your way through this, right?
Right. Well, two things I'm appreciating is that you're, and I've had to do this a lot in my work, you real as a nurse even. I'm also not a social worker, and you'd be in someone's life for 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours period, and then they're gone. And you do have to, I've always called it as knowing what's mine to do, because it's not all yours to do. And you have to do what you do, what's yours to do, and do it really, really well. But let a lot of it go, or refer them on to someone else, or sometimes just bless them and pray for them and say, God bless you on your way, because I know this is a tough road ahead. And someone like me, I'm not going to be there to help you, and I can't be. But there's two parts of this coming from lawyering that I'm really interested in, and I wonder if you could tell me how it's affected your ability to not re-traumatize the client, keeping everybody safe, and the second point, to protect your own self, regulate your own self from vicarious trauma. Can you talk about how your new knowledge has dealt with those two issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when it comes to the clients, I think one important aspect of our training was actually recognizing the physiologic manifestations of trauma. So understanding when people are, for example, uncomfortable, in a conversation with you, how much of that is like, you're meeting with a lawyer and that's just inherently uncomfortable, or how much of that is a manifestation of increased cortisol and, other aspects of trauma. And just the little that we learned about that has already been helpful in understanding and creating, I would say, like, boundaries is maybe a loaded term, but certainly a recognition that, now is the time to bring something up, and now is the time to not bring that thing up, right? There's definitely been a change, at least in my practice, of recognizing that not everything has to be said right away, or in that moment. And so that's changed certainly in my client interaction. Like, I really try to meet people where they're at. And I try not to take it personally when, some information, let's say, isn't as forthcoming as would be helpful for me in that moment. So those kinds of things have changed. I think I shouldn't say the biggest, but a big thing that has come out of this is how we prepare our clients to be examined for discovery and at trial. Right? This is an inherently re-triggering, re-traumatizing process. Litigation is not for the faint of heart. It's hard. You have to retell your story. You often, as the plaintiff, feel like you're the defendant for some reason. And it's very, very difficult for people who have gone through the lived experience of the trauma to have to retell it, and to tell it in this like confined way. And so the way we prepare our clients for those parts of the process, we take more time than I think we had historically. We, explain sort of the systemic barriers that exist, that may, for example, like if I'm not piping up during examinations for discovery every time my client is uncomfortable, they might feel like I've abandoned them, right? That I'm not on their side. So explaining, why certain things have to be asked and answered, when you're going to hear my voice and why you're going to hear me. And it's not that, I'm listening to everything, and, I'm there for you. I'm sort of like, part of your team, at that moment, and, explaining how that works has changed a lot. Personally, I feel like the way that I will speak to counsel going forward in terms of, and it's already happened, but I'm sure it'll happen more, sort of giving them caution about sensitive areas that, it will be difficult for my client, and just sort of asking for, that to be taken seriously, and for them to act with a level of kindness. I mean, most lawyers are really good about stuff like that, but it's important. And I've had many occasions in which what doesn't seem to be a contentious issue to the lawyer, or like a sensitive issue to the lawyer, is deeply, deeply uncomfortable for my client for reasons that, we don't necessarily know. So that's how the client experience has changed. I could go on, but I think that's a summary of that. And And in terms of protecting ourselves, I think it's the vicarious piece is really important. That in terms of an insight that actually was something that did come out of our training is that all of us had recognized that this was sort of a void in our knowledge, but all of us had experienced vicarious trauma. Even those of us who say, I'm fine, it doesn't affect me, I go home and I feel, completely fine and I sleep well at night. All of us had experienced it. And so, asking for help, like asking for like a second person to sit in on a meeting, to help you sort of navigate those situations, talking more amongst your colleagues about, the issues that have come up. And I think there's a level to, particularly, I can say for me and some of my colleagues, feeling like the litigation system is slow. It's often painful for lots of reasons. And it doesn't provide that immediate recourse that we wish we could give to our clients. So like, what else can we do? Well, we can sort of educate our clients on how to advocate for themselves. Like, let's say at the college level, using the patient relations system at the hospital, the ombudsman, these sort of alternative routes that I think from a vicarious trauma perspective, at least help us mitigate that feeling of being helpless, and not being able to address or respond to their problems. And those are some sort of strategies and tips that we've developed, but it's an ongoing process. It's by no means did we take the training and now we're completely informed and don't have to think about it again. That's actually the opposite of the point. I think having these discussions, even talking to you here today is part of, I think, that discourse is let's just keep it going and let's talk to each other about it and let's make it a priority, right? Like we can admit that there's something we don't know. We're not fully informed about, and it does have a bottom line impact on our clients, right? Not being able to tell their story because you don't know their story is a really big problem. And as advocates who are tasked with that narrative, it's just non-negotiable at this point.
I appreciate so much your last point that you just said there, because something I brought up to several people, but to both Olivia and Kara, is that lawyers have often told me that there's so many more potential malpractice cases out there, even birth litigation cases that aren't touched, and looking at why and how to reach people and just inform them somewhat. And we both Olivia and Kara talked about the potential is that the re-traumatization of telling the story, especially to in an unsafe place or to an unsafe person, is just too much. It'll either keep them away from a conversation with a lawyer, or they'll ghost the lawyer after an appointment or two if they don't feel safe and protected. So it's interesting that you brought that up, that the approach to patients, how that might affect the bottom line. And I'm not a lawyer, that, and I'm not really pro litigation, but when you look at some of the stats about the number of serious medical errors versus the number of lawsuits and damages that are awarded, that come to light, and the people that might really need the kind of support that a medical malpractice lawsuit can offer. I think it's been a big stumper for a lot of people for a long time, but I have no doubt that finding a safe place to lay down your trauma and tell your story is critical.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And, I can't say that like my intent in becoming trauma informed was to get more cases. Certainly not. Actually, it's to service my clients whose stories I'm tasked with telling. But I think your point is a good one, is that there are people who can't access this system because of trust and inability to feel safe. And I think those of us who do this kind of work, it's incumbent upon us to recognize that and to make the system more accessible for everybody who needs it. Not everybody, as you say, needs litigation, but there are some people who do. There are some people for whom, that recourse is life-changing and important. And yeah, I think that's why I certainly have a call to action to all of my colleagues and peers who in this space who do this type of work, really any work that deals with vulnerable and injured people, to be aware that, this is something that is worth becoming familiar with and worth navigating for both your existing clients and for prospective new clients.
Yeah, brilliant. And well done. I'm so proud of you for bringing this to light and bringing me this idea. I've learned so much, like I said, and I just wish I'd known it a long time ago, but I know it now. And you're early in your career and you know it now. So that's really good. And the people listening will learn it now.
Thanks, Chris. And I have to give you a big thanks for giving space to this discussion and for being so invested in having the dialogue. And I think the way that you've gone about it and in speaking to all of the sort of key stakeholders here, I think I'm actually the least important part of this 4-part picture, because this is really being lived out by people, who are experiencing harm, and then the people who are trying to help, right? Like Kara and like Olivia. And so I thank you so much for bringing it to light.
You're welcome. But it was your idea. I just want to say that. So we had talked a little bit about you presenting a birth trauma case with us. Are you able and willing to share that with us? Do you have a story or two to tell us?
Yeah, I do. I have a few. I mean, listen, like I said, we do a lot of this work, and for a long time, I think we weren't fully appreciating the really big piece of the puzzle and story that parents in particular can bring to really fully understanding the even forget the trauma for a second, but even just what happened, right? Trauma will prevent memories from surfacing. Trauma will impact narrative in that people are not able to talk about it fully. People are not able to recognize exactly what happened to them fully. And so I've had many instances, one in particular, and it's a really, really, it's one that really sits with me pretty heavy. The thing about obstetrical negligence is, particularly when you start investigating it early, and depending on the severity of the brain damage, typically it's brain damage, not always, but often, we don't know what the damage to the child is going to be, right? We hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And that initial conversation with parents is so difficult, and much more difficult than I ever really even realized, because how do you say to these parents who are inherently hopeful that the damage that they're already seeing won't get worse, right? That they won't have a reason to proceed with the lawsuit in a year or two, that everything will magically be okay. How do you tell them, that your experience is that it probably won't be, number one? Number two, that investigating a case at this juncture is an important thing to do, but B, won't give them, the closure that they're looking for, likely, regardless of the outcome of an investigation. And I remember many occasions in which I investigated a case and the damages were obvious that there would be damage, but the level, the specificity of what those might look like were not yet apparent. And I remember investigating the case and coming to the conclusion that the healthcare practitioners had breached standard of care, that very likely, based on our experts, that breach, caused or contributed to the loss and to the injury. And going to this meeting and expecting, it's one of the earlier ones that I had done, expecting that the parents would be happy to know that there was going to be a case, right? Because that's what they tasked me to do. And I delivered the news. I typically do a pretty fulsome reporting letter that I don't give beforehand. I do it simultaneously, or I, hand them the reporting letter after our conversation. And I fully expected them to be happy, and they cried, right? Like they cried and they cried, and they were devastated to learn that this was preventable or potentially preventable, right? That there was an opinion out there that this was preventable. And that was really at the moment, I don't think I really truly understood what I was thinking, and even thinking that this could be good news for them. But that was really eye-opening. And the other part of that story is mom in that particular case wasn't terribly forthcoming with me in terms of what had happened. And I didn't realize until much later in the litigation, it was because she was carrying an enormous amount of guilt about what had happened. And it's because in this case in particular, it was a very prolonged delivery, and basically asphyxiation of the baby in a prolonged insult. And there were many moments in the medical record where mom had voiced concern, right? That she had said something doesn't feel right. And even beyond what was in the medical record, there were even more moments I learned from dad that both of them had voiced concern, and it was not recorded and it was not responded to. And it just didn't realize that she felt such guilt about not being able to do something, right? Not being able to protect her baby. She felt like she didn't protest enough. She didn't say the right things to advocate for herself and for her baby, not realizing, well, I'm sure she does realize to a certain extent, but this is how trauma works, that, she was the vulnerable one in that situation, that she was in a situation where the system was meant to protect and help her and listen to her. And that's, the way that it happened is just not how it's supposed to happen. And that feeling of guilt didn't get better because I told her that this was, potentially negligent. It didn't get better. It actually got worse. And it affected everything, right? It was like we had to do so much collateral information gathering to really put together a picture that, to the extent that, she didn't experience this trauma, I'm sure she could recount exactly what had happened. And and I got to say, for some people and for some stories, it is like that. Like they actually remember they have they're hyper vigilant to the details because they played it in their mind so much after. So it manifests differently for different people. But this particular case was just it was so evident to me, how unfair the system can be for women in particular. And that displaced sense of blame and shame and guilt can really just affect everything. I remember the first time that I met the family in their home. This was pre-COVID, of course. And she couldn't even really interact with her baby when we were there. And I had asked dad about it later, right? Like, because I wanted to get a sense of was there, some postpartum depression involved, all that kind of stuff. And he said, no, it was just really your presence there, was a big reminder for her about what had happened. And it was very difficult for her to look us in the eye, to talk about her baby's deficits, and we sort of approach all of these things as almost like an investigation, right? It is an investigation. We're trying to figure out what happened, and we kind of got to get to the cold hard facts. But you can't really get to cold hard facts in a situation like this, whenever you want. You can't just walk into somebody's home and expect that they're going to be forthcoming. And sometimes it's not even about trust with you. It's just their experience, their lived experience is so traumatizing. So that was, I've had countless of those situations. And I think since becoming a mother, I look at them differently for sure. But the training and the discourse, I will say the discourse about this has definitely put that into light. And now the lessons from those experiences are informing the way that we're, talking to people now and expecting their help in terms of putting together the narrative and the liability and all that kind of stuff. It's just different now. We're just recognizing things that we couldn't really put a name to before. So that's my anecdote about it. I mean, it's countless. I think anybody listening to this and any of the lawyers who do this kind of work will say, yep, that's almost every one of my experiences. So yeah, it's more so naming the problem. We gotta name the problem. We gotta name what we're looking at, and what we're looking at is trauma.
Such a great anecdote. First of all, thank you for sharing that, because I'm just sitting here thinking I could go back 100 different times where I probably was looking trauma right in the eye and didn't even know it. I'd be labeled difficult or angry or mad or in pain or 1,000 things without ever once considering the 30 years that had happened before they were in my space, And with healthcare providers too, I mean, this isn't about that necessarily, but I've taught at a lot of nursing conferences across the country, and there's never been one that someone hasn't come up to me. It's all about legal issues in nursing, that someone hasn't come up to me at the end of the day with a story. And it's interesting that you talked about the guilt, because from the healthcare provider perspective, when things go wrong, statistically nurses feel guilt, even if they weren't the decision maker, even if they were just in the room, even if they were just on the unit that day. Doctors feel a loss of control and might respond in a different way, but nurses feel guilt and a heavy sense of responsibility. And so I can't even imagine the level of guilt the mother feels if she feels, because it's the same idea. I should have spoken up. I should not have stood by and watched or seen that happen without, advocating for my patient. But I'm sure it's, -1 compared to what the mother must be feeling if she gets a sense.
Well, and I think this is a gendered issue, right? I think women in particular are socialized to feel guilt in ways that men are frankly not. And guilt is such a low frequency feeling. Like it's so bad for us in so many ways. And yeah, putting that in the context of being a new mother who has the physiologic need to protect their child is really just a complexity that we can't even begin to understand, I think, unless you've experienced it. And how that intersects with then the lawsuit and the litigation is just, it's a topic for an entire course, I'd say.
It's a topic for an entire lifetime, I think. There's so much to learn. Well, we've been talking for almost an hour and a half, Sonia, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I feel like we could talk another hour and a half easily. But I'm going to ask you one more question that I ask everybody at the end of every podcast, because I like to get some pearls of wisdom, or your best pearls of wisdom. Because podcast listeners include healthcare providers, lawyers, and the public, please answer this question for the following audience. And let's start with healthcare. Let's start doctors and nurses. In your view, what is the most important thing that you would like doctors and nurses and midwives and nurse practitioner, everybody who falls in that group of healthcare providers, to know about medical malpractice or the experience of trauma in healthcare?
I'll start with what I'd like them to know about medical malpractice, and that's really very simple. Everybody makes mistakes, right? Like to error is human, and nobody in the medical malpractice system is trying to suggest that, you are a bad person or that your reputation should be marred forever because of one error. Everybody makes mistakes, and the medical malpractice system is designed to ensure that there's protection when that happens, right? This is not about character assassination. This is not about a value judgment. It's just simply looking at the facts and understanding that there's consequences when errors do happen, unintentional. And there needs to be protection in place for people who have to deal with those consequences. And that's what the system is about. And it's really not personal. I think that's an important thing, maybe an understated thing that we should talk about more. It's really not personal. When it comes to trauma, I think the biggest thing that the healthcare system and its actors need to understand is that they are in a position of power. right? There's a inherent power differential. That's where the whole fiduciary obligation stuff comes from. They're in a position of power, and that power can manifest in ways that are completely implicit. And maybe you don't recognize it in the moment, but it's important to recognize that power differential. It's important to understand how that can affect the way you're talking to your patient, the experience that that patient is having, being in that space and room with you. And it's just, you can't dissect that away from your practice. It has to be part and parcel of your practice.
That's a great answer, Sonia. That's maybe one of the best answers I've ever heard, and so clear and simplified. Well said. Well said. Let's answer for another audience now. Let's answer for lawyers. What's the most important thing you would like them to know about, I don't know if I want to say trauma in healthcare, trauma in the law office, or just lawyer-informed trauma. You are trauma-informed lawyering. You take your pick there and answer.
I'll take the question of what do I want them to know about trauma-informed lawyering? I would say that it's non-negotiable now, right? We're now so far into this important discourse that none of us have the option to opt out, right? We have to really, it's particularly those of us who are client-facing, who are advocating on behalf of people that are vulnerable, whatever vulnerabilities have come to light. And we are in a position of power, right? As lawyers, we are in a position of power, and with power comes great responsibility. And our responsibility is to become informed about our plaintiffs' and patients' experiences, and how that intersects with what we're trying to do for them. So it's non-negotiable. You don't have to do a full, training course if you don't have the capacity or ability to do it, but have the conversations. There's so many free webinars now. There's so much good content on LinkedIn. Myrna McCollum is a wonderful Indigenous lawyer who talks a lot. She calls herself the trauma-informed lawyer. She has a podcast too, who's so wonderful to learn from. And she puts on lots of free content. She hosts conferences all the time as well. And these are really, really important initiatives that we all need to buy into. And it's not just about one thing, right? It's multifaceted, and it's beyond our scope often. So we need to get help to learn. And that's okay. Getting help to learn is a good thing.
It is a good thing. And that's another great answer. Thank you. Thank you. Let's talk to the public now. What's the most important thing you'd like them to know about, and answer it either for medical malpractice or trauma in healthcare, or both, whatever's on your mind?
What I'd like the public to know about medical malpractice is that the system feels very inaccessible and overwhelming when you Google it, right? Lots of people, the first thing they'll say to me when they call is, I know it's really hard to sue doctors. Yeah, that's true. Litigation is not actually supposed to be easy, number one. But there is a path forward to the extent that your claim is meritorious and that your damages are, sufficient, that this is a recourse that you need to be thinking about. So, call a lawyer and talk to them about your problem. If you don't feel comfortable giving all the details, that's okay. But pick up the phone and have the conversation if you feel like something has happened that shouldn't have, number one, and that it's caused an impact in your life that doesn't feel surmountable to you. That's I think what I would want them to know, is that you can access it, right? It's not a completely inaccessible, amorphous thing that exists on the outside. It is something that all of us who do this kind of work are working really hard to make it more accessible. In terms of trauma-informed lawyering, I think the public should know that we have taken notice and note that this is an area that we need more information about and we need to be delving into. And a lot of us are doing the work to become informed. And we understand that, it's important to the work that we do that we become informed. So I would say, we're trying, we're doing our best. And I think there's so many of my colleagues and peers outside of, both within my firm and outside of my firm, that do recognize this need and are really trying their best. So give us some time to get up to speed, but we're really trying, and we've taken note that this is an important issue.
Another good answer, and hopeful for the future. Those are all the questions I have for you right now, but is there anything else that you'd like to say?
I don't think so, Chris. You've done a wonderful job covering these important topics, and I just have to thank you again for giving us the space to do it.
You're so welcome, Sonia. And thanks to you so much for the generous sharing of your time and your wisdom, your personal story, your professional story. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I am so glad we had this conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much.
If you haven't listened to the other podcast by Sonia, the shorter, more personal one about herself, don't miss it. It's always insightful to learn about the person outside of the work that they do. So have a listen and tell all your friends and colleagues. And thank you, all of you once again for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe and leave us a review. And don't forget that in many jurisdictions, nurses, doctors, and lawyers can claim continuing education credit for listening to the podcast. It's available on all the usual platforms, and we have an Inside Medical Malpractice YouTube channel where you can find this as well. And if you are a malpractice lawyer who needs a healthcare expert of any kind, give us a call. We're here, and you can contact us at experts@connectmlx.com. Be sure to tune in next month for the final episode on trauma-informed lawyering as we continue to learn together. Thank you so very much.